Welcome back to The Curious Case, where every story feels like the unfolding of a thrilling tale shared over a cup of coffee. Today I bring to you a captivating mystery that will pull you into the world of the ever-observant, sharp-witted Miss Marple, Agatha Christie's beloved amateur sleuth. Make yourself comfortable, because we're about to dive into a story of secrets, whispers, and hidden truths. And if you're joining us for the first time, leave a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little community of detectives is coming from. Now, let's begin our investigation. Miss Marple and the mystery beneath the rose garden. It all started with an unexpected arrival at Miss Marple's quaint cottage. A thick cream envelope, its handwriting unmistakably florid and extravagant, belonging to none other than Lady Harrowby. A name Miss Marple knew all too well, for she had once been a darling of high society, her dramatic flair the subject of many village gossip columns. Lady Harrowby's garden parties were infamous, not only for their lavishness, but also for the undercurrents of scandal that often swirled around them. This invitation, however, was different. It wasn't just any party. It was a celebration of the peak bloom of Lady Harrowby's roses, which, according to her, were the finest for miles. But it wasn't the flowers that piqued Miss Marple's interest. It was the subtle undercurrent of tension that she sensed just from the invitation. She knew, as always, that these affairs were rarely as simple as they seemed. The journey to Rosewood Hall confirmed her suspicions. The once pristine estate, now showing signs of neglect, seemed a shadow of its former grandeur. The hedges were untamed, the gates hanging slightly askew, and the grand facade of the mansion looked tired and worn, as though it too had been weathered by the years. Even the house seemed eager to welcome her inside, its door opening before Miss Marple had even raised her hand to knock. A young maid, her curtsy awkward and rushed, led Miss Marple through a dim hallway, where the faint scent of mildew hung in the air and sunlight filtered through heavy drapes, casting an eerie glow. Miss Marple's sharp eyes took in every detail: the tarnished silver, the damp creeping up the walls, the perfectly arranged roses on the hall table. It was all so meticulously maintained, yet there was something undeniably off about the place. The garden party, as expected, was a curious blend of genteel manners and palpable tension. Guests exchanged polite pleasantries, but there was an undercurrent of suspicion that Miss Marple could sense with every passing moment. As always, the roses were the talk of the town, but it wasn't the flowers that had everyone's tongues wagging. Whispers began to circulate around the cake table. The gardener, a man of many years of service, had left abruptly. No one knew why, but rumors spread like wildfire. Some said it was family matters, while others suggested a quarrel with Lady Harrowby herself. And then there was the more chilling story. Strange noises, faint but unmistakable, drifting from the rose garden at night. Miss Marple's expression remained serene as she listened, her mind already piecing together the fragments of information. A sudden departure, ghostly sounds, and a lady whose dramatic past had a way of resurfacing. She knew that where there was smoke, there was often fire. As the evening wore on, Miss Marple's sharp mind turned these new clues over and over, realizing that the mystery at hand was far more sinister than anyone could imagine. Rosewood Hall's secrets were about to be unearthed, and Miss Marple was ready to uncover them, one piece at a time. As the evening drew on, the garden at Rosewood Hall took on a strange, almost unnerving stillness, like a secret waiting to be unearthed. Lady Harrowby, resplendent as ever, had begun to lose her usual poise. Her forced laughter, as she discussed the roses, now felt hollow, her gaze flickering to the statue at the far end of the garden, as though it held the answers to questions she wished to remain unasked. Miss Marple, as always, observed quietly from the corners of the gathering, knitting with precision, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. The sudden departure of the gardener, along with the odd ghostly sounds said to drift from the rose garden at night, stirred something in the air, a restless energy that whispered of buried truths. As the last of the tea was served, and guests began to trickle out, an unsettling conversation emerged. Mrs. Lydia Brent had disappeared. Last seen near the rose garden after a whispered conversation with Lady Harrowby. Her absence quickly cast a shadow over the gathering. Miss Marple, though silent, was already connecting the dots, sensing that the garden, with its quiet allure, was hiding much more than mere flowers. The fading daylight made the garden appear eerily silent, but it was the buried soil near the statue that drew her eye. A place where something, or someone, had clearly been hastily concealed. She kept her thoughts to herself, letting the evening unfold while the guests grew increasingly uneasy, their laughter brittle and forced. By supper, the tension was palpable. Lady Harrowby and her family, usually the picture of charm and hospitality, were now tightly wound. The gardener's daughter, pale and withdrawn, paced near the roses, speaking in hushed tones to the flowers as though they could answer her. And Mr. Latimer, ever the jester, laughed too loudly, his presence masking something far darker. It was clear that the garden, with its beautiful blooms, held a secret, and Miss Marple, as always, was determined to uncover it before the truth slipped away like the last remnants of daylight. Lady Harrowby, with her forced cheerfulness, managed to keep the party alive, but there was an undeniable edge to her charm, something too practiced, too desperate. Her eyes flickered toward the windows, with an unease that couldn't be masked by her smile. Miss Marple, ever the silent observer, noted the subtle cracks in the facade. Beneath the mask of hospitality, something darker stirred. Later, as the house quieted, and the guests grew restless in their uncomfortable politeness, Miss Marple sat with an older village woman, who held the keys to long-forgotten secrets. Over cups of tea, the woman recounted the tale of a maid who had vanished 30 years ago, after a whispered affair with the late Lord Harrowby. The maid's disappearance had been buried along with the gossip, but the rose garden seemed to hold its secrets in its roots, as if the earth itself remembered what had been hidden. Miss Marple listened carefully, her eyes betraying nothing, though her mind raced. People often dismissed such tales as nothing more than superstition, but in her experience, there was always a grain of truth buried beneath the stories. That night, as the rain stopped and the moonlight bathed the garden in an eerie glow, Miss Marple stood by the window. There beneath the roses, she saw it, a shadow, low to the ground, digging with frenzied urgency at the very spot where the soil had been disturbed earlier. Her heart quickened, but her expression remained serene. She had seen enough to know that the past had a way of refusing to stay buried. The next morning, as the mist lingered and the village stirred, Miss Marple made her usual rounds. She walked slowly to the village shop, her shoes tapping lightly against the cobblestones, but her mind was already a step ahead. The villagers, as always, were ready to gossip, and Miss Marple was the perfect listener, patient, unassuming, yet always able to coax out the details others would rather keep hidden. It wasn't long before the story of the vanished maid resurfaced, with fresh details and a deeper darkness. The maid, it seemed, had been more than just a servant. She was a beauty, one who had drawn the eye of the late Lord Harrowby. The shopkeeper's voice dropped to a whisper, as she stirred her tea, her eyes darting around the room. "Too pretty for a house like that, you see," she murmured, her tone laced with a quiet suspicion. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until the truth became clear. The maid had vanished without a trace. But the garden, her final resting place, had never been at peace since. As Miss Marple pieced the fragments together, the parallels between the past and the present grew undeniable. The same shadow that had haunted the garden 30 years ago had returned, and this time, Miss Marple would not let the truth slip away. The roses, it seemed, were still hiding more than just petals. In the deepening twilight of the Rosewood estate, Miss Marple found herself once again drawn to the garden, the heart of all secrets buried beneath the soil. The evening air was thick with a damp stillness, and as the wind whispered through the roses, there was a certain weight to the silence, as though even the flowers held their breath in anticipation. The village had long gossiped about the old gardener's peculiar behavior, his obsession with the statue, the long hours spent digging near the base, as if searching for something that eluded him. Some said it was nothing but the restlessness of an aging man. Others whispered that it was the land itself, holding on to something long forgotten. But Miss Marple, with her sharp eye for the truth hidden beneath layers of complacency, knew better than to believe in mere coincidences. The earth around the statue had always been disturbed, yet no one dared question why. The gardener's abrupt departure had been explained away as a family emergency, but Miss Marple could see through the polite lies woven around the event. She had learned long ago that when something is buried with such urgency, it is not a simple matter of forgetfulness. That afternoon, as the golden hue of dusk faded into shadows, Miss Marple's intuition led her once more to the statue. She knelt down, her fingers brushing against the cool, damp earth. It was then that she felt it. Something odd, something out of place. A shard of bone, jagged and weathered, protruded from the soil like a hidden truth waiting to be unearthed. The realization struck her quietly, like a thief in the night. No one had known what the gardener had been searching for, but Miss Marple knew. He had found something, or perhaps feared it would be found. Her heart raced with the understanding that this was no ordinary mystery. It was a puzzle that stretched far back in time, a twisted thread connecting the past to the present, one that once pulled, would unravel a history of dark secrets. The ground beneath her fingertips was not just earth. It was a graveyard of long-held fears and buried sins, and she would not stop until the truth was dragged out into the light. Miss Marple slipped the shard into her pocket with a quiet sense of finality. Bones buried in gardens were rarely of interest to those whose hands were stained by guilt. They had a way of ignoring such things, as if they could simply will them away. But for Miss Marple, the garden whispered secrets that others were too eager to dismiss. It was later that evening, when the sky turned a deep indigo, that she returned to the rose garden. The scent of the flowers hung thick in the air, but the beauty of it all seemed at odds with the sorrow in the garden. There by the old statue, she found the gardener's daughter kneeling, her small body trembling, her hands pressed deeply into the earth, as though pleading with it. Her voice, barely above a whisper, repeated the same phrase over and over like a mantra. The garden remembers. The garden remembers. It was clear to Miss Marple that these were not words of superstition, but of a deep, painful knowing. The girl's voice was thick with fear, yet there was something more beneath it. A sorrow that spoke of a past that had been buried long before the roses had bloomed. Her father's warnings had been branded into her mind, tales of an earth that could never forget, of a garden that was alive with its own terrible memory. Miss Marple's hand rested lightly on the girl's shoulder, and the girl flinched violently, pulling away as if she were still trying to escape the ghosts of her own mind. "It wasn't me, miss. It wasn't me," she gasped, her words falling into the thickening dusk. But Miss Marple could hear what the girl wasn't saying. The fear of knowing too much, of having seen things no one should see. "I know what's there," the girl murmured, her voice barely audible, "and I know what's still to come." Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. She allowed the girl's broken words to hang in the air, the weight of them sinking into her like the earth itself. There was a darkness here, a deep-rooted fear, but it was not the girl who had planted it. The village of course quickly seized upon the easy narrative, the troubled daughter, steeped in the secrets of her father, losing her grip on reality, and spiraling into madness. It was the perfect story, one that fit too neatly into the world they knew, a story that made them feel safe in their own ignorance. But Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, knew better. She had seen how easily people could be made into scapegoats, how conveniently a suspect could be constructed when the truth was too dangerous to acknowledge. She could feel the village's judgment creeping through the air, weaving its poisonous threads into the fabric of the girl's life. But Miss Marple did not rush to conclusions. Troubled people, after all, were not always guilty. Sometimes they were merely bearers of dark knowledge. It was the ones who benefited from her silence, the ones who would find comfort in the village's ready-made conclusions, that Miss Marple turned her thoughts to. Who, she wondered, would be most pleased to see the girl painted as the culprit? Who stood to gain from her confession, from her silent acceptance of a guilt she might not bear? As the village's murmurs grew louder, Miss Marple's mind worked in the background, piecing together a puzzle that others were too eager to dismiss. It wasn't the gardener's daughter who truly held the key. It was those whose hands were too clean, whose eyes looked away from the shadows, They had a way of ensuring the truth stayed buried, much like the bones hidden beneath the rose-scented earth. Miss Marple, with her quiet but perceptive mind, had come to believe that the entire web of events surrounding the mysterious happenings at Rosewood Hall had been meticulously orchestrated, not by someone driven by greed or a thirst for revenge, but by pure self-preservation. Lady Harrowby, with her extravagant dramatics and flair for the theatrical, had lived a life steeped in misdirection, a master at shifting attention away from her own actions. Colonel Harrowby, quick-tempered and ever watchful, was no less adept at deflecting questions that might reveal inconvenient truths. Yet for all their practiced deflection, it was Mr. Latimer, the family friend, who had truly caught Miss Marple's interest. Latimer was the type of man who knew just enough about everyone to be a danger, charming, endlessly helpful, and with a smile that never seemed to waver. But whenever the subject of the garden arose, there was a subtle change in his demeanor. His jokes became louder, his grin slightly more forced, as if something was hiding just beneath the surface of his polished exterior. Miss Marple had spent years observing the people around her, and she understood better than most that villains did not always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes they were the ones sitting beside you at tea, offering sugar with one hand while concealing their darkest secrets with the other. Then came the storm. It arrived with a fury, the air itself heavy with the weight of something long buried, as if even the sky could no longer keep the secrets it had been holding. The wind howled as the rain pummeled the windows of Rosewood Hall, the sound so relentless that it seemed like the very house might give in to its onslaught. It was during one of these violent gusts that Miss Marple, standing quietly by the drawing-room window, noticed something out of place. The garden shed door, which had always been firmly locked since her arrival, was now swinging open, its rusty hinges creaking in protest. It was an odd thing, given that Lady Harrowby had shown no interest in revealing the shed's contents, and had been quick to dismiss any questions about it. But Miss Marple, with her insatiable curiosity, could not simply let it go. With a knowing glance to ensure she wasn't being watched, she draped her shawl around her shoulders, and stepped into the rain-soaked night. The air inside the shed was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying wood, the kind of scent that suggested years of abandonment. As Miss Marple's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed something strange. A loose panel in the far wall, its edges worn down by time, had been jarred open by the storm. Beneath the panel, hidden from view for what seemed like an eternity, was a small compartment. She eased the compartment open with practiced hands, uncovering a single ivory glove, its fabric yellowed and fragile from age. The glove, though seemingly innocuous, sent a chill down Miss Marple's spine. Why was it here? Why hidden in such a secretive place? And why, after all these years, had it been revealed now, as the storm raged outside? Something told her this was no coincidence. It was as though the garden itself had chosen this moment to remind her that the past was never truly gone. It merely waited, quietly, for the right time to resurface. The glove, once a pristine ivory, had been stained deeply with a rust-colored mark, an unmistakable trace of old blood, faded by the years, but stubbornly refusing to be erased. Time had not been kind, yet the bloodstain lingered, persistent and resolute. It was not the hurried discard of a panicked moment, nor had it been carelessly thrown aside. No, this glove had been folded with great care, as if its owner had meant for it to be discovered, but only by someone who could understand its significance. Someone like Miss Marple. Her fingers gently traced the edges, noting the delicate size, the kind of glove worn not for everyday tasks, but for elegance, an accessory meant to be seen. This was no mere forgotten item. It had been placed here deliberately, as though the very fabric itself was a quiet confession, waiting patiently for the right person to unravel its secrets. Standing there in the damp, forgotten shed, Miss Marple paused, listening to the storm rage outside, the wind howling against the roof like a warning. Her mind, always working, sifted through the fragments of information she had gathered, whispers of a vanished maid, the gardener's strange silence, the uneasy tension that clung to the garden itself. Beneath the glove, hidden with reverence, lay something else, A photograph. Its edges curled and faded with time, its surface worn thin by countless hands that had turned it over and over, perhaps searching for answers too. But despite the years, the image was still shockingly clear. A young woman stood among the roses, radiant and smiling, her beauty captured in a moment long past. Miss Marple studied the face carefully, her sharp eyes recognizing something she couldn't quite place at first. It was only after a moment that the certainty crept in. The woman in the photograph bore an uncanny resemblance to Mrs. Lydia Brent, the very same woman who had mysteriously vanished during the garden party. A sudden chill ran through Miss Marple as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. If the resemblance was not just coincidence, then it could only mean one thing: the missing woman and the disappeared maid were connected by blood, mother and daughter, separated by decades, yet inexplicably drawn back to the same place, the garden that seemed to hold the answers to all their questions. The roses, it seemed, were not just plants, they were guardians, silently keeping watch over the secrets buried in the earth. With the photograph now carefully slipped into her pocket, along with the glove, Miss Marple knew the investigation was far from over. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many lies left to untangle. But for the first time, she felt the past reaching out, its fingers brushing against the present, and she knew that whatever it was that had been hidden in the soil for so long, it was now ready to be uncovered. As she returned to her seat by the fire, the knitting left forgotten beside her, Miss Marple allowed the fragments to settle, the pieces of the mystery slowly taking shape in her mind, one careful thought at a time. The truth was closer now, but it was still elusive, waiting to be revealed. If the vanished maid had borne a child in secret, quietly, out of sight, that child would have carried not only the physical resemblance of her mother, but also the heavy burden of her absence, a legacy of silence and unanswered questions. Perhaps Lydia Brent had always known of this hidden chapter, a family secret whispered just beyond her reach, too late to change the course of her life. It could have been the accidental discovery of a birth certificate, hidden in an old drawer, a document forgotten but never truly gone. Or perhaps Lydia had only suspected, driven by an instinct she couldn't fully explain, that something about the history of Rosewood Hall had been concealed from her. Drawn back to this place, compelled by a force beyond her understanding, she had begun to probe deeper, to ask questions that stirred memories others wanted to leave buried. The garden, it seemed, had a strange way of calling people back, urging them to confront the past. And once she was here, surrounded by the roses that had grown so lush and vibrant, Lydia Brent must have started knocking at doors no one wanted opened. Her curiosity, like a double-edged sword, led her to the very things that were meant to be hidden. Miss Marple, always patient and keenly aware of the dangers of too much curiosity, understood this well. Her fingers, which had traced the edges of the photograph so many times, now stopped. Daughters do not simply inherit their mother's eyes or their smiles, Miss Marple thought. They inherit their unfinished stories, the unanswered questions, the lost threads, the tangled webs left behind when lives are cut short. And in that moment, it was clear to Miss Marple that Lydia Brent had not merely inherited her mother's features, she had inherited her unresolved past. Another roll of thunder echoed across the sky, shaking the window pane. As Miss Marple sat alone, her reflection barely visible against the glass, she felt the familiar weight of truth settling in. Guilt, she knew, had a way of passing down through generations, like a tarnished heirloom, each one determined to bury it deeper, only for it to claw its way back to the surface. Secrets buried deep in the earth did not die. They grew. They tangled and festered, waiting for the right moment to be uncovered. The soil of Rosewood Hall had been nourished by these secrets for decades. The roses, whose roots stretched deep into the earth, had flourished not only on water and soil, but on the weight of the family's hidden truths, on their collective silence. With a soft sigh, Miss Marple folded the photograph carefully, placing it next to her knitting. The path, it seemed, had finally returned, not with a soft whisper, but with the full, undeniable force of its truth. She knew then that there was no turning back, no burying the past once more. The truth was alive, and it would soon demand to be heard. It was shortly after breakfast, when the house still carried the brittle quiet that follows a night of restless thoughts, that Lady Harrowby's maid stepped forward. Her hands were clasped so tightly together that her knuckles shone white against her skin. When she spoke, her voice was little more than a whisper, fragile and filled with a quiet dread. "I know about the bones," she said, her words hanging in the air like the last traces of a storm. The words she spoke held more weight than she could have understood, and in them MissMarple recognized the final key that would unlock the truth behind the mystery that had haunted Rosewood Hall for so long. The maid who had served at Rosewood Hall before her spoke in a tone as though she were reciting an old family legend, one passed down like a cursed heirloom, murmured in hushed voices around a crackling fire. Yes, she confessed. She had walked the garden at night, felt the weight of the earth beneath her feet. But as she spoke, her voice trembled, and yet, curiously, she swore she had no hand in Mrs. Brent's disappearance. Her words were delivered with a careful precision, each phrase seemingly rehearsed. MissMarple, ever the observer, sat calmly in front of her, her hands neatly folded in her lap, her expression one of gentle concern. She did not ask questions nor challenge the maid's words, yet within her silence was a quiet, unwavering certainty. This wasn't a confession. It was an act, a performance carefully crafted for someone who might be listening in the shadows, poised to catch every word. After the maid left, excused by a house that had already resumed its uneasy rhythm, MissMarple remained seated by the window. Her knitting was forgotten in her hands, her mind restless with the weight of the maid's confession. It wasn't the content of what was said that troubled her, but rather the ease with which it was offered. MissMarple had spent years unraveling mysteries, and in her experience, guilty parties never confessed so smoothly. Fear, guilt and pride, she knew, made confessions hesitant, reluctant, like an old wound being torn open. But this had been too polished, too rehearsed. It was as though the maid had practiced her words before a mirror, smoothing out every hesitation. MissMarple suspected the confession wasn't entirely the maid's own. It had the careful touch of someone who was used to managing narratives, who had learned to manipulate the truth to serve their needs. Someone perhaps, like Lady Harrowby, or another equally invested in maintaining the fragile, gilded image of Rosewood Hall. In this house, MissMarple realized, guilt was not a loud cry of admission. It was a whispered secret wrapped in silk, served with a cup of tea. Unable to sleep that night, MissMarple settled into her accustomed spot by the window, her eyes scanning the garden now shrouded in a thick silver mist. The world, she knew, often reveals its hidden truths to those who remain still enough to listen. It was just past midnight when the figure appeared, silent and cautious, as though carrying the weight of guilt and desperation in every step. Moving through the garden gate, the figure's every motion was deliberate, as though they feared being seen yet couldn't stop themselves from going further. The garden, once so full of life, now seemed to hold its breath as the figure approached the heart of the mystery. A mystery MissMarple knew was now on the cusp of unraveling. As the figure moved toward the shadowed path, the air grew thicker with tension. Each step brought them closer to the truth, and MissMarple's pulse quickened, knowing that the answers she sought were now closer than ever. The game, it seemed, was about to begin in earnest. The garden, still carrying the scent of disturbed earth from the night before, stood as a silent witness to the truth that was being slowly uncovered. MissMarple remained motionless, her gaze fixed on the figure in the garden, the same spot where the soil had been unsettled hours ago. As he knelt and began to dig, hands desperately clawing at the earth, it became clear to MissMarple that he was not merely searching. He was begging the ground to surrender its secrets. She watched, unmoving, until the moonlight illuminated his face, and in that fleeting moment, she recognized him, the missing woman's fiancé. The grief that weighed on his shoulders was undeniable, the urgency in his movements palpable. But MissMarple, with her years of experience, knew that grief was not the same as guilt. The two emotions, though often entwined, were distinct, and she could see the difference with startling clarity. The next morning, as the sun rose and the garden still smelled of disturbed soil, MissMarple took her tea alone, the silence of the place only interrupted by the occasional flutter of birds. It wasn't long before the fiancé appeared, his shirt sleeves stained with dirt, his eyes hollow with the weight of his search. MissMarple greeted him with a gentle smile, offering him a second cup of tea, a gesture of kindness, not accusation. It was this quiet, unobtrusive kindness that seemed to loosen his tongue. He admitted, in a low voice, that he had been searching for something Mrs. Brent had mentioned in passing, some long-buried family secret hidden among the roses. Something that might explain why she had returned to Rosewood Hall after all those years. She was obsessed, he murmured, as if the words themselves pained him. Something about her mother, the garden, and a story she could never quite understand. His hands trembled slightly, not from guilt, but from a helplessness that gnawed at him, the kind of despair that came from knowing you were too late to prevent the inevitable. Miss Marple listened quietly, nodding once, as though she had always known this truth would surface. She said nothing, allowing him the space to speak, her mind already piecing together the puzzle. When he left, and the garden settled back into its usual stillness, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of reflection. She now knew that the maid's confession had been a lie, crafted for someone else's benefit, an attempt to deflect suspicion. The fiancé's midnight digging, though driven by grief, was also a lie of omission. It was a frantic act of a man desperately seeking the truth, but unwilling to face the full consequences of it. Yet, in all the lies, both told and untold, there was one undeniable truth: the garden itself was the key. The roses, with their silent beauty, had witnessed it all, had stood guard over a story that began long before Mrs. Brent's disappearance. A story that echoed the fate of another young woman, long ago, who had walked the same path, asked the same questions, and paid a terrible price for her curiosity. Miss Marple folded her knitting, her mind already leaping ahead, pulling the threads of this long-forgotten tale together. The truth, she knew, was like a seed buried deep within the earth. It would grow tangled and hungry, and eventually, it would force its way to the surface. She could feel it now, the weight of the secrets just beneath the soil, pushing upward, ready to be unearthed. And when it came, it would bring with it a revelation that would shake Rosewood Hall to its very foundation. Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands steady as she continued knitting, her thoughts lingering on the quiet revelations that had begun to surface. The past, she knew, had a way of lying dormant beneath the earth, waiting for the right moment, the right hand to uncover it. How astonishing it was, she often thought, how willing people were to reveal the truth, if only the right question was asked, or sometimes more effectively, if no question at all was posed. It was the silence, after all, that often coaxed the most. In the days following Mrs. Brent's disappearance, Miss Marple continued her habitual walks through the village, exchanging pleasantries with the butchers, the bakers, the postmasters, and even the pensioners who lived on the edges of town. The conversations drifted, as they always did, toward the garden party, a seemingly innocuous event now overshadowed by the mystery that had enveloped Rosewood Hall. Curiously, it was not Mrs. Brent's disappearance that seemed to preoccupy the villagers. Instead, their whispers circled around the nature of her relationship with Colonel Harrowby. It was not merely the closeness of old friends, but something deeper, something that felt more like a dangerous secret hanging just beneath the surface. A postmistress, who had never been one to keep her opinions to herself, recalled seeing the two of them together in the rose garden long after dusk, a sight she had never forgotten. Another villager, reluctantly speaking under the weight of Miss Marple's quiet attentiveness, remembered hearing raised voices from the garden path on more than one occasion, always right before Lady Harrowby would retreat to her room, claiming a headache. The pieces began to fall into place easily for Miss Marple, a clandestine affair, hidden among the very roses that seemed to guard the house's darkest secrets. Miss Marple knit on, the steady rhythm of her needles matching the quiet working of her mind as the story began to form. That afternoon, she spread her findings out across the small desk in her room, the photograph worn and creased, the blood-stained glove folded with unnerving care, and now, a village wedding announcement clipped from an old newspaper. In the faded photograph beside the church door stood Mrs. Brent, looking youthful and full of life, unmistakably the same woman, though the years had changed her. Beside her, smiling with a sense of pride, was her mother, whom Miss Marple knew all too well. It was the same woman who had vanished, the same mother who had left behind a daughter to carry the burden of a mystery far too heavy to bear. MissMarple's eyes narrowed in understanding. Mother and daughter, bound not just by blood, but by a tragic history, by a life stolen too soon, and by a secret that had been buried deep beneath the earth, waiting patiently for the daughter's feet to follow the same path her mother had once walked, a secret that now, it seemed, had begun to stir, slowly inching its way toward the surface once more. The connection between the two generations was undeniable, and steeped in tragedy, a tale that had been waiting to be told for years. Two women, drawn inexorably back to the same house, to the same garden, both unknowingly digging for the same unburied truth. MissMarple paused, folding the wedding announcement with care, and it all suddenly clicked into place. She finally understood why Mrs. Brent had come to Rosewood Hall, what she had been searching for, and why someone had been so determined to stop her from uncovering it. Later that evening, in the solitude of her room, MissMarple's thoughts meandered further back to a time even older, a time before Mrs. Brent had stepped foot into Rosewood Hall. Guilt, after all, was rarely confined to a single generation. In MissMarple's long life, she had learned that guilt could settle into the bones of a family, lingering like damp creeping through cracks in an old house. It didn't just vanish with the passing of time. It seeped, it festered, and it often spread, becoming something deeper, something rooted in the very foundations of a family's history. The tragic story of the young maid, too pretty for her own good, who had caught the eye of the master, was no isolated incident. Her fate had become entwined with the house itself, a dark wound that had never truly healed. This wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a family's shared secret, buried under layers of silence, a secret that had shaped the very essence of Rosewood Hall. Mrs. Brent, whether aware or unwilling to acknowledge the warnings of her mother's ghost, had come to the house with the intention of unearthing this dark past, to demand answers from a garden that had already been forced to keep too many secrets. And now, in her search for truth, Mrs. Brent had become part of the cycle, just another soul drawn into the tragedy, that refused to let go of the house, of the family, and of time itself. MissMarple leaned back, allowing her thoughts to solidify into understanding. Guilt, she reflected, doesn't die with those who commit the crime. It doesn't simply vanish into the past. Instead, it gets passed down from parent to child, subtly shifting and evolving, growing stronger with each passing generation. It's shaped by silence, by fear, until it no longer feels like guilt at all. It becomes fate, an invisible hand that guides each generation to the same dark conclusion. That evening, as MissMarple shared a quiet tea with Colonel Harrowby, the conversation was, on the surface, civil and filled with pleasantries, talk of the weather, of roses, of the unpredictable nature of English summers. Yet beneath it all, MissMarple could sense an undercurrent of tension, a feeling like a tautly pulled thread, that threatened to snap at any moment. Every time the conversation veered near the garden, she noticed the Colonel's hand tremble ever so slightly, a nervous reaction he could not fully conceal. The sound of the teaspoon faintly rattling against the saucer was almost imperceptible, but to MissMarple, it was as loud as a bell. Colonel Harrowby's once confident smile had faded, stretched thin, as if he were desperately trying to suppress something far too large to contain. He smiled, but it was a strained gesture, a mask that barely concealed the fear lurking beneath. MissMarple, ever the keen observer, didn't ask direct questions. She never needed to. It was always enough to listen, to note what was left unsaid, to watch how his eyes flicked nervously to the rose garden with a constant, almost involuntary motion. The fear in his gaze wasn't one of discovery. He wasn't afraid of being caught, but something far more unsettling. Fear of inevitability. The garden, it seemed, was ready to tell its story, whether the Colonel wanted it to or not. Later, when the Colonel excused himself, claiming an unsettled stomach, MissMarple didn't rush. She knew the moment had come. Quietly, she made her way to the garden alone. The air was cool, softened by the rain, the earth beneath her shoes yielding with each step. She walked the familiar path with measured care, pausing at the oldest rosebush, its blooms heavy and fragrant. This was the spot. She could feel it in her bones, the place where the first secret had been buried, the root of this tangled web of guilt. It would not take much, just a spade, a gentle hand to uncover what the roses had hidden for so long. Beneath the soil, beneath the years of silence, lay the final piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple's fingers brushed against the petals, delicate as a whisper, and in that moment, the garden seemed to speak. It was a quiet murmur in her mind, a voice she had come to trust. The house, silent as ever, held its breath, only the occasional creak of old timbers disturbing the stillness. From her bedroom window, Miss Marple sat still, her hands resting softly in her lap, her eyes drifting once more to the garden below. There in the moonlight, a shadow shifted, a movement so subtle at first, she thought it might have been the wind, the branches bending under its touch. But no, this shadow moved with purpose, its outline distinct against the silvered landscape. She watched, unblinking, as it bent low, hands desperate and frantic, scrabbling at the earth. There was a kind of madness in the motion, the frantic urgency of someone who wasn't planting something, but trying to unearth it. Miss Marple didn't rush. She never did. She had spent a lifetime learning that the truth, much like a seed, came to light best when approached gently. The frantic digging continued, but Miss Marple remained patient. She understood, as she had so many times before, that some truths could only be coaxed from the earth with time and care. And so she waited, the silence around her growing heavier with each passing moment. The night held its breath, as did she. She stepped out of her room with the quiet grace of someone who understood the weight of old secrets, her slippers whispering against the wooden floor, each step measured, deliberate. Outside, the night was cloaked in silver mist, the garden breathing beneath the moonlight, like something alive and waiting. Miss Alara Dane had always known that no truth stays buried forever, especially not in gardens where roots remember, and the soil has a voice. As she descended the stone steps, her eyes fixed on the far end of the garden, where the shadows no longer hid but beckoned, she saw it, the figure hunched near the ivy-choked arbor. Not a ghost, but something just as haunted. It was Lady Adeline Greaves, her once regal form draped in a now sodden nightgown, her hands filthy, clawing at the earth with a raw desperation that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with release. She dug like someone possessed, as if unearthing the past was the only way she could breathe again. Miss Alara stood still, saying nothing. In such moments, words are powerless. The truth speaks louder when wrapped in silence. Lady Adeline paused, sensing the stillness behind her, and slowly turned. Her face was pale, streaked with mud and memory. There was no attempt at excuses, no shield of dignity, only a flicker of recognition, and the collapse of years in a single broken sigh. "I had to," she whispered, though it wasn't clear if she spoke to Alara, the earth, or the ghosts that surrounded them. Alara offered no reply. The garden, after all, had already begun its confession. Together, without instruction, they knelt and dug, pulling away layers of soil damp with rain and regret. The ground gave way to something solid, an old iron-bound chest, nearly consumed by roots and rust. It groaned as they opened it, the hinges resisting like old bones cracking after years of stillness. Inside, there was no mystery left, only bones, delicate and curled, as if trying to hide from death itself. A single ribbon of blue lace clung to the remains, faded but unmistakable, a maid's uniform. Alara's hands folded gently before her, her expression soft, unreadable. There was no judgment, only the gravity of truth, finally unearthed. Lady Adeline sank beside the trunk, her trembling fingers brushing the bones like one might touch a child's cheek. "She was just a girl," she murmured, the words breaking in her throat. And in that moment, beneath the watching roses and the moon's pale eye, the garden exhaled, and the past, at last, was laid bare. Young Miss Alara said nothing, because sometimes, silence is the only answer guilt cannot ignore. The estate had barely begun to stir, unaware that their carefully preserved world was already unraveling. as muffled footsteps echoed in distant corridors, and curious whispers bloomed like morning fog, Elira turned away from the rose garden, drawn by a sound so faint it could have been imagined, a soft rhythmic scratching, like a secret trying to speak. It led her to the old garden shed, tucked beneath creeping vines and long-forgotten tools. The padlock dangled from its latch, haphazardly fastened, as though whoever secured it had done so in panic. She pushed the door open with a breath held tight in her throat, and there, crumpled on the floor like an abandoned marionette, lay Mrs. Calder Brent. Her skin was pale, her breath shallow, her body curled inward as if trying to disappear. The heavy scent of lenham, sweet, medicinal, unmistakable, still clung to her clothes. Someone had drugged her, someone had hidden her, and someone, Elira now realized, had intended for her to stay hidden. But secrets, like roots, grow restless in the dark. Elira knelt beside her, pressing 2 fingers gently to the woman's wrist. The pulse was there, weak but steady. She had been silenced, nearly erased, for knowing too much. And yet, the truth had clawed its way back. As the first rays of dawn broke over Thistlebridge Manor, Elira stood once more at the edge of the garden. The air was heavy with the scent of soil freshly disturbed, not just by shovels, but by memory. For decades, the garden had been a place of wonder. Neighbors praised its roses, perfect in bloom, too perfect. Guests spoke of their unmatched color, their richness, unaware of what fed them. Now Elira knew, those roses had drawn strength not from sunlight and water alone, but from silence, grief and bones long buried. She folded her hands in her lap, the wool of her knitting forgotten, and watched as the household began to stir behind the windows. There was no more hiding now. The earth had given up its secret, and with it, the illusion of peace. In time the roses would bloom again, but this time in truth, not deceit. And as the staff gathered at her soft request in the drawing room, summoned not with alarm, but with her gentle unwavering gaze, they entered not into an ordinary morning, but into the reckoning of everything they had tried so hard to forget. Lady Evelyn Darnell stood stiffly by the hearth, her knuckles white as they gripped each other tightly in her lap. Across the drawing room, her husband, General Darnell, had stationed himself near the tall bay window, staring blankly into the fog-drenched garden he once adored, now unable to set foot in it. The scent of roses still drifted in through the cracks, but to him it smelled like rot and regret. Near the doorway, young maid Clara trembled, her eyes wide with a truth she had carried far too long, while Mr. Vincent Hale, the ever-jovial family confidant, tried to wear his usual smirk, though the tremor in his fingers betrayed the effort. And there, in the room's quiet center, sat Miss Elira Vale. The needles of her knitting paused, resting gently in her lap. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence was that of a woman who understood how time speaks, not in shouts but in patterns, habits, and the soft betrayals of body language. She didn't accuse. Elira never needed to. She told a story instead. A story the garden had told her first. A story stitched from overlooked glances, stray whispers in hallway corners, the rustle of skirts at midnight, and the kind of truth only silence admits. It began, she said, not with malice but with desire. 32 years ago, a maid named Lillian, bright-eyed, too beautiful for her station, had drawn the attention of the former master of the house, Lord Cedric Darnell. It was a flirtation he treated lightly, a passing indulgence. But Lady Evelyn had seen it, seen the glint in her husband's eye that no longer turned to her. And while Lord Cedric forgot Lillian with the next hunting season, Evelyn did not. In her heart, a wound festered. Jealousy, Elira whispered, is not born in darkness. It grows in the light of things we believe should be ours. When Lillian became pregnant, whispers grew louder, and Lady Evelyn saw the facade she had curated of devotion, tradition, elegance, threatened by a single girl with a child that bore Darnell blood. One night, it reached a boiling point. There was no witness, no scream, just the echo of a raised voice behind closed doors, and then silence. Whether it was a push, a fall, or something more deliberate, No one knew. But Lillian never returned to her quarters. Her belongings were quietly removed. Her name never spoken again. And beneath the southern garden, where the roses grew fullest, the soil was turned under the cover of darkness. Lord Cedric died months later. Some said of a broken heart, though others whispered it was guilt that poisoned him. But Lady Evelyn lived on, tending those roses, preserving her illusion. The years passed. The garden flourished. Guests marveled at its impossible blooms. And no one asked why. Beneath those roses, the earth never settled quite right. But Elira had asked, not aloud, but in her way. She'd watched the gardener flinch when a certain bush was mentioned. She'd noted how Clara hesitated when fetching water near the southern edge. And she'd seen the tremble in Lady Evelyn's hands every time someone praised the roses. Gardens, Elira said softly, absorb everything they're given, and in time they bloom with the truth. Now that truth stood bare in the center of the drawing room, as heavy as the dawn mist outside. The past had not stayed buried. It had grown tall, fragrant, and undeniable. It wasn't curiosity alone, but a dangerous blend of greed and recklessness that led the new caretaker, Edwin Pike, to uncover the bones beneath the ancient wisteria tree at the edge of Greystone Manor. A man with debts and little conscience, he knew exactly what he had found, and instead of notifying the authorities, he saw a golden opportunity blooming in the rot. Quietly, methodically, he began extorting Lady Celestine Greystone, claiming expenses for imported seeds, rare fertilizers, even phantom labor, all veiled beneath garden maintenance receipts. At first the sums were small, barely noticed. But blackmail, like a weed, grows fast and wild. Edwin asked for more. Then too much. He started to whisper threats, to hint at letters, evidence, and just as suddenly, he vanished. Officially dismissed for conduct unbecoming. He was bundled out of the village overnight. No one saw him again. Rumors, like ivy, began to creep. But the manor kept its silence. That silence shattered with the arrival of Eliza Bray, a young woman whose own mother had disappeared under cryptic circumstances 3 decades prior. Drawn by a pull she couldn't explain, Eliza had returned to Greystone, following the echoes of a life she was never allowed to know. She asked questions, innocent ones at first, about her mother's service at the manor, about a locket she found, about the garden. But innocence, Miss Elwyn Mirth said with somber grace, can be the most dangerous thing in a house built on secrets. Eliza's inquiries stirred buried memories, and desperation began to shadow Lady Celestine. One evening, as fog swallowed the garden paths, Eliza was quietly drugged and locked in the abandoned gardener's shed, a place long forgotten, save for its dark past. But the ground, Elwyn whispered, had already begun to shift. Rain had unearthed fragments near the roots. A neighbor's dog had brought home a cracked bone. And once the earth begins to speak, it rarely stops. The truth seeped out like moisture through stone. And when Eliza was found, delirious but alive, the whispers turned to screams. Elwyn's voice dropped as she delivered her final reflection. Not a judgment, but a truth rooted in time itself. Gardens, she said, do not forget. They keep everything that's ever been given to them. Seeds, secrets, sorrows. The roses of Greystone Manor were famed for their lush, impossible beauty. But beauty, she added, often demands a price. And these roses had been fed not just with water and sunlight, but with betrayal, bone and blood, layer upon layer, year after year, until their roots tangled with ghosts no one had dared name, until now. And so the blossoms of Thornmere Estate continued to bloom, year after year, not just with color, but with the weight of memory embedded in every petal. Eleanor Vaughan, the once revered matriarch, sat motionless by the window, her fingers trembling ever so slightly, her gaze lost in the wild garden that had once obeyed her every touch. But now it was no longer hers. The vines had crept beyond her command, the soil no longer her ally. For decades, The estate had guarded a secret darker than the earth it was buried in, waiting, not to be erased, but to be found by the right hands. It was Margot Lyle, a quiet archivist with no intention of disturbing the past, who stumbled upon the key, a forgotten letter tucked inside a hollow book in the estate library. What she found sparked a chain reaction, questions that had no safe answers, doors long closed, swinging open, and the realization that her bloodline was tangled far deeper into Thornmere's history than she ever imagined. Her investigation led not just to a confession, but to the slow unraveling of a legacy built on guilt, deception, and a single irreversible act. The roses that had once drawn admiration from the town now bloomed like mourners, full and rich, their scent almost sweet with sorrow. And as Eleanor's secret spilled into the light, it became clear. This wasn't merely the story of a hidden crime. It was about how guilt, when unspoken, can become an inheritance, silent, invisible but crushing. We tell ourselves that time heals, that the past fades. But the truth, as Margot discovered, is far more unsettling. Time does not erase what has been done. It only conceals it until someone dares to look closer. Gardens, after all, remember what we try to forget. They bloom not only from care, but from what lies beneath: broken promises, buried truths, and blood once spilled in silence. So now I ask you, if you had been Eleanor Vaughan, living with the knowledge of a body buried beneath your roses, would you have spoken the truth, or let the garden keep your secret forever? Would you choose silence, knowing the cost? Share your thoughts in the comments. I want to know. Because stories like this aren't just tales. They're reflections of choices, of conscience, and of what we do when faced with the weight of the past. And if you felt the chill of Thornmere's tale, don't forget to subscribe. There are more secrets waiting to rise, more roots hiding darker truths. Because the most haunting stories aren't the ones we invent, they're the ones we unearth. And every garden, no matter how lovely, is hiding something beneath the bloom.